Good morning, everybody. This is Stephen Pugh. I wanted to give a small video here. I do a series of videos. I do isolated videos now and again on the subject of things that are happening in the world today, and I want to do one today. I want to do one because I want to express my opinion about something that's happening in the world in relation to the COVID pandemic, and in particular the relation to John MacArthur and his church. I've been thinking about this for a few weeks. There was a video posted recently in which he was quoted, and the videos were shown of him speaking, in which John MacArthur came before his congregation and said, we won against the city, we won against the county ordinance, we won against the health advisors who wanted to shut us down as a church during the pandemic. I think that this was a hollow victory, a very hollow victory, because having declared that they won in court, okay, and that the health board had no authority to shut them down, so they say, we then discover that he then reveals what really happened. During that time when people, he says, were just turning up at our church, he said, we initially they said we shut down, but he says people were just turning up at the church. I mean, like sort of, if I might describe it like this, just like the tumbleweed just happens to come across the car park. People just happen to turn up. I think that's disingenuous. If people had turned up at my church, they'd have found the door locked. We weren't there. And there were millions of churches all over the world that were just shut. And for him to say, oh yeah, people just turned up and, they wandered in wondering why they were there, and they wandered in, and they found that I was there with a sermon and everybody was ready, and so we had a service. So what he's doing, you see, is he's blaming all of the individuals of the church for the mistakes that he's about to make. If he'd obeyed the city ordinance, and don't forget, the city ordinance, they are the ministers of God, according to the Apostle Paul. They are the ministers of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. And the people of the city vote, and they put into office government, whether it's health board or whether it's political government or whether it's whatever it is. They're appointed by the Lord and they are to be obeyed. Okay. And he says, yeah, people just turned up, and so what are we supposed to do? So we held a service. What John did there was to completely defy a ordinance of the city that said that he should not be meeting with people. He should not be meeting in close contact. He shouldn't be meeting unmasked. Okay? And what he did was to get up and preach an ordinary service in an ordinary way with people being close together and unmasked. Now that is breaking the city ordinance. That's breaking the law. Okay? Now, the next thing that he says is this. He says, now that we've won, we can tell you what really happened. What do you mean, John? What do you mean, tell us what really happened? Do you mean you're now going to tell us the truth, whereas previously you hadn't told us the truth? You see, during this time, when he was fighting the city about whether they're allowed to meet or not, it turns out that he was telling everybody from the pulpit, and we can see this in his preaching. We can see these in the messages that he gave in the church. He said, oh, we're trusting in God. God is going to God is going to keep us safe, and nobody's getting sick. Nobody's getting sick in the church. We don't believe that we're going to be getting sick. Okay? So now at the end of the time when he's won his case, so he says, against the city ordinance, he now gets up in the pulpit and said, actually, we did get sick. Okay? My wife and I did get sick. We got sick with COVID. We were very poorly for 2 or 3 weeks. So what he was saying in a public, when he said, oh, we're all well and everyone's fine, was not the truth. He did get sick. And he said something else even more alarming. He said the pandemic swept through our congregation. Now, he's not telling us any details about that. He's not saying how many got sick. He's not saying how many died. He's not saying how sick they were. He's just saying, yeah, the pandemic swept. One can only imagine how bad it was in his congregation. You know, there is such a thing as bearing false witness. There is a thing called bearing false witness. It's telling an untruth. But you know, when we tell an untruth, there are 3 aspects to it. The first is when we say something that's blatantly untrue. I think John did that. He was telling everybody we're all fine, there's no pandemic, nobody's poorly, everybody's okay. And that wasn't what happened at all. That's a blatant lie. The second thing is telling only part of the truth. That's a lie too. That's bearing false witness. And then the third type of untruth is being silent when you should speak. I didn't know this. For many years, I didn't know this. I thought that a lie was when you specifically say an untruth. That isn't necessarily the case. It's when you tell something and people derive a wrong impression from what you've said. That also is an untruth, because that is a deception. At that particular time, I think John knew that people were drawing incorrect conclusions, but he didn't correct it. And then there's a third thing in which the person says, well, I didn't say an untruth. Yes, but you kept silent. And silence sometimes is bearing a false witness. So, but there's another thing which is even greater. At the time when he was declaring that everybody was safe and the church was fine and nobody had COVID, they didn't even wonder whether there really was a COVID. At the very time in which he was saying that there's no COVID in this church, there's nothing to see, okay? He was calling upon God. He was thanking God for the fact that they hadn't got COVID when actually they had COVID. Now that is blasphemous. You say, why is it blasphemous, Steve? Because you see, it's not just thou shalt not bear false witness. It's thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that you swear? No. Does it mean that you use God's name, that you speak his name? Not quite, no. You know, people are able to refer to God by name. That's not blasphemy. Blasphemy is when you use God's name to justify a lie or to justify a vow which you have no intention to keep. Now that's blasphemy. That's taking his name in vain. But then there is a third thing that I want to talk about with John MacArthur and his church, and it's this. Not only did they bear false witness, in my opinion, and not only did they blaspheme the name of the Lord by bringing God's name into the deception, but they did a third thing. They kept it quiet. That vast church, there wasn't a single person that blabbed. There wasn't a single person that rang the city ordinance and said, you're being deceived. There wasn't a single person that made a report to say, I've got coronavirus and I'm attending this church. In other words, both John MacArthur and the board of elders and the leadership board of the church and all the members and all the families and all the children and all the young people, they all kept quiet. They all kept quiet together. Nobody said a word. This was a conspiracy of silence. It was a conspiracy of false witness. It's bad, isn't it? You know, when a church does something like this, or when a minister of the word does something like this, it's going to be a disaster. The Lord cannot honor false witness. Now, the challenge to everybody is this. Is this true? Is what John MacArthur did and what the church did true? Did they keep quiet? Did they disobey the city ordinance and try to win a case against the city, saying that there was no pandemic and that nobody had it and the church was completely safe, when actually they did get COVID and the pandemic swept through that congregation? Because if that's what actually happened, that's false witness. Not only is it false witness, it's calling upon God to witness the lie that they were saying. And thirdly, it was a conspiracy of silence. And those three things together will be the death knell for that ministry. You know, you could say, well, what should have happened, Stephen? Well, first of all, John MacArthur confesses himself to be a reformed theologian. What he means by that is a follower of the reformers of former days. When Martin Luther was faced with a pandemic in his day, did he keep his church open? No, he didn't. He locked himself away. He put himself into isolation. He obeyed the city ordinance. Okay? And he survived. What he didn't do was to continue to meet. He didn't do that. And he didn't say to everybody publicly that everything's fine when it wasn't fine. Didn't do that either. And he didn't teach the whole of his congregation and everybody in it to be part of the lie. He didn't do that either. So this is a very serious matter. What he should have done was to just say, look, we understand that there's dangers out there. We're going to shut the church. We can go online. We can preach online. There's no COVID restrictions about preaching online. We can do that. And that's what we all did. That's what all the churches did. But there is a certain amount of arrogance. And there's a certain amount of pride. And there's a certain amount of falsehood, I'm afraid, that has been manifested through these revelations. I'm very sad to talk about this, very sad. And all sorts of questions need to be raised about what should a Christian do in these times. Well, currently in England, we are able to meet now as a church. The COVID status in the country is naught. We're at the naught stage. I know that lots of people are still afraid. I know that there's lots of so-called statements of infection. I understand that. And I know also that there's so many deaths, whatever that deaths might be, whether it's from COVID or whether it's from COVID. We don't know whether it's with or from, because there's a difference, isn't there, between dying with something and dying from something. I mean, for example, if I died at the moment, I would die with white hair. But it isn't the white hair that's killing me. And when people say we're dying with COVID, well, I would be dying with white hair, but it isn't the white hair that's killing me. So there's a certain amount of discrepancy and a certain amount of wisdom that we need to have to be able to differentiate between what people are actually saying. And this isn't really about my views about COVID. This is really about John MacArthur and the antics of him and his church. Now, this isn't meant to be a hate video. This is not a hate video. I love the guy. I don't agree with everything he says. I agree with a lot of what he says, but I don't agree with everything he says. But I'm very disappointed for all the reasons that I've given. And I just felt it was important for me to come online here and express my view. Anyway, everybody, I wish you every blessing. and look forward to hearing from some of you. Maybe you'd like to send me feedback of this. Bye for now.